Hello again, everyone. Welcome to Inside the Birds. Adam Caplan here with an old friend, Samir Suleiman, former Vice President of Football Administration for the Carolina Panthers, and a man who saw the greatest show on turf some years ago up close. Samir, good to see you again.
You too, Adam. Thanks for having me back by popular demand.
There's a lot I want to cover today, but leading up to the draft now, as we speak here, what would you be doing if you were the Panthers right now or any NFL team? What does a VP of Football Administration do 48 hours before the draft?
Really, just kind of reviewing your board because by now it's been stacked the way you want it, and any last minute discussions about what do we do if this guy falls, what do we do if this team calls and offers this, things like that. Just any last minute scenarios, kind of internal mock drafts, have you things
Oh,
like that.
so would you do on your own, or the personnel department? Like, I've heard this before. I know teams say they do it. So would you guys do your own mock draft?
Right, you kind of do it, where you say, well, if we're picking here and these are the people that are on the board left, this is who
Sure.
we're taking, things like that. You try to work through the scenarios so that there's no surprises when you're on the clock.
High school, you played football, and what's interesting, very few contract negotiators have played football before. Even at a high school level, you played in high school and in college at James Madison. As you rolled on your career and you were done playing, obviously you didn't play in the NFL, but you would work in the NFL. But what got you to the NFL? Where did you go after you're done school?
So a week after I graduated from JMU, I moved to New York City. I had a job lined up at the NFL Management Council. And so that's where I wanted, of my options of starting my career, that I kind of narrowed it down. That was my best option. Actually, as a matter of fact, I had an offer from the Philadelphia 76ers too, so I could have been a Philly guy like you and Flip. But I wanted to stay in the NFL, and I thought that with what the Management Council did, which is, they basically run the league for the commissioner. I thought that'd be a great place to start my career and learn the business from the ground up, and then I could always go work for a team from there, which obviously I eventually did.
So then you moved to the Rams, and man, when you went there, again, you played football, you played receiver. So, all right, bring us inside. What was it like to be around Mike Martz, that crazy offense, Marshall Faulk, Holt, Isaac Bruce, and all that talent? What was it like to be around that offense?
I was the primary negotiator, and after my first
Mm.
year, we did not have a pro scouting director, so I assumed those roles too.
Mm.
And I was basically
Wow.
the secondary football executive, which is like an assistant GM, but back then nobody had that title in the league. So, um, yeah, and I handled all the negotiations, the budgets, a lot of
Jeez.
scouting duties.
How old were you then?
I was when I went there, I was 25. I think I was one of, if not the youngest directors in the league.
Holy smokes. How did you handle all the winning? Mike Martz, I know is challenged a great coach, but he's a guy who's got a strong opinion. How did you did you have mentors there? I mean, how did you
I
get through
did.
everything?
Fortunately, I had the opportunity to work for Jay Zygmunt, who was the president of football operations and general manager. Um, Great individual. I learned more from him than probably everybody else I worked with and for in the league
Mm,
combined. All my stops. I mean, just
wow.
taught me something every day. Very humble individual, and so that's kind of he helped keep me grounded just with all the success that was going on, and is just very instrumental in just talking about always do what's best for the organization. It's not our money, but we have a fiduciary responsibility to ownership to do what's right. So it was I'm very fortunate to have worked under him for 9 years.
All right, so you worked under the management council. You learned how to do contracts. You were with Jacksonville briefly. You had a ton of responsibilities in your 20s with the Rams, pro scouting, contracts. The first thing I would want to do before we move on to the Steelers, which is really another cool organization, the salary cap this has been around 94. So you're talking about less than 10 years of the salary cap. How have contracts and salary cap changed since then to you?
Well, obviously the money, when I started in this business in 97, I think the salary cap was probably was a little less than $41.5 million, which is hard to believe. But the biggest thing that changed, I feel like obviously the money's grown, the contracts are larger, there's a larger percentage guaranteed. Um, the things that I've noticed, not for the better is the lack of negotiations. It just seems like when I started, there were a lot of tough negotiators around the league, And now I feel like instead of, when you see these star players coming up for negotiations, um, instead of like a hierarchy of okay, this player is clearly uh, better than this player, but not as good as this player, so he's going to fall in line with that. Now it's just, well, who's next? And teams are
Sure.
paying players that aren't even the best at their position, and they're paying them as the highest paid ever at that position. So it just seems
Hmm.
like there's just a lack of logic, and I think part of the reason for that is there's so much money coming in. It's a multi-billion-dollar year business that with the salary cap that high, teams are able to just, give out these contracts, and then if they don't work out, they're able to cover up their mistakes and absorb all the dead money. Whereas, in the past, you had to be really careful, not to give the wrong contract to a player because then you'd be really handicapped, going into a season if you had too many of those bad contracts.
Hmm. So you moved over to Pittsburgh, and the Steelers, Samir, as you know, because you're involved in doing it, they craft contracts. Every year it's the same. It's a major, huge signing bonus. 1 year of fully guaranteed money, if that, and that's that. But the big salaries are high. And then obviously you moved on to Carolina. So how did like what we don't have to talk any specific teams in terms of this question or this point, but how do you like doing contracts? Like when you see what the way Pittsburgh do it again, they're an old school team. We know the Bucks do it a certain way, Eagles do it a certain way. We'll talk about that in a minute. How do you like doing contracts?
I had I've been fortunate. A lot of the teams I worked for, when I went to Jacksonville, Michael Hugh, he was known as a great negotiator. I was able to learn from him. And then, like I said, working for Jay. And the great thing about working, with Jay in St. Louis and then in Pittsburgh is they had a lot of established presidents with contracts years before I was there. It was really just my job to kind of maintain those and then improve on them if I could. But for the great part about, especially like working with the Steelers is, Ambassador Rooney, he used to negotiate contracts, back in the
Oh,
day. And so, if there was something that he wanted to do, we did it and he supported us and it was never putting ego or precedent ahead of the main objective, which was to win Super Bowls. And so that's when you have the support of ownership or the person above you at the general manager position, like it makes my job so much easier.
hmm.
It's kind of where that's lacking, where that's where the negotiations become tough because it's not really fun dealing with agents. So
Let's talk about the free agency process because you talked about agents. So at the end of every season or start of the off season, I know that each club will get a cash budget. Who sets it? When do these meetings happen? How do you learn about what your cash budget is going to be every year?
So ultimately, ownership sets it. Obviously, it's their money. And what we would do, or what I would do, is, as soon as the season ends, kind of prepare for our financial budget meeting, which we always had before free agency starts in mid-March. So ideally, you'd like to have that meeting before you go to the combine at the end of February. And it's really just me kind of laying out what we're on the books for contract wise, what I think we're going to need to spend that year with either extensions to our own players or in the free agent market if we're gonna look in there. And then it's kind of putting everything together and really operating under, it depends on how involved the owner is. Obviously, if he's very involved, he's going to set the budget. If he's not very involved, he's going to appoint what I call like a wallet watchdog in the form of a president or CFO that they're going to set the budget. And then it's kind of just going to them and saying, it's like, okay, here's what we need. Can we have it?
So let's talk about cash over cap. The Eagles are the kings of spending more cash way over the salary cap. And you mentioned signing bonuses, option bonuses. Very few teams do them. Eagles are the kings of them. What do you think of the option bonus structure?
I go back to my first year, really my first, I think, few weeks, if not month, with the St. Louis Rams. We did, I think, the first ever option bonus, and it was non-guaranteed for Kurt Warner, coming
Oh,
off both regular season and Super Bowl MVP years. Where it was actually like a true option because we didn't know if he was a 1 year wonder, and so we kind of wanted to protect
oh.
ourselves. And then in the case that he wasn't a 1 year wonder, which he was not, he was paid like one of the best quarterbacks in the league. And I think what the Eagles started doing years ago, they were kind of exploiting a loophole in the compensatory draft system where with these option bonuses, if the options weren't exercised and the players become free agents, and that counts towards their compensatory um, pick formula. And I think a couple of years ago, the league office, kind of closed that loophole on them. But No, I mean, it gives them an opportunity to kind of, have a call it a right of first refusal, have you, if that's something that they want to just maintain their players longer.
Now, were you big? Although I've seen some of your contracts over the years, so you've done roster bonuses. What's the advantage of a roster bonus?
I think the roster bonuses, depending on when you have them, but there's two types. There's ones that are set on dates, and so a lot of teams, at least the way I structured them, is it's a way to get a player a little bit more money earlier. If you have it early in the offseason, like right around the start of free agency, then it's almost kind of like a deferred signing bonus. The advantage to the club too is that uh, if it's a player a couple years into the contract that maybe he's not living up to that contract or he's had injuries, then it kind of forces you to make a decision on having him on the roster going forward. It's kind of, all right, you got to make this decision now or not. You're going to pay this money or, because once you pay it, usually they're, at least $1 million. You
Yep.
ideally hold on to that player instead of just wasting it. The other form of roster bonuses that I really like were the per game roster bonuses, which some teams do, which those are great for, number one, it's an easy way for players to make money, right? All they have to do is just be active for games. But then it also kind of protects the team if that player has an injury history and say, okay, well, if he's hurt, he misses a lot of the games, you're going to get some salary cap relief from that.
The theory of cash over cap, is it just basically being able to prorate bonuses, whether it's option or signing? When we're talking cash over cap, we want to help people learn. What is it? What does that mean to you, cash over cap?
The cash over cap, obviously you have the salary cap that the league sets, and a lot of teams, the way, and the cap is so high now that you really should be able to operate, and like I said, I have in the past with your cash budget matching the salary cap. But, again, it's up to ownership. If they want to spend more than the salary cap, and the way you do that is really with signing bonuses. I think I did a study a couple years ago, and I think the average team spent probably about 21 million cash over cap. Um, I think a lot of the LA Rams the last time they won the Super Bowl, I think it was
Yeah.
pretty well known that they spent I think $97 million cash over cap, but they had a trophy to show for it, so
Yeah.
it worked out for them.
All right, let's talk about the draft process. So these pre-draft visits, the combine interviews, is there good value for a guy like yourself when you're involved in these?
The best thing about the combine and the Senior Bowl is, first of all, that's where your interviews start. So
Hmm.
you're kind of you know, you're only you know to that point you'd only seen players on tape, and now you actually get to sit across from them. If you have any questions about their character, their football IQ, you address them. Obviously, the combine has a very thorough medical process that's invaluable. So yeah, I think it's just part of the due diligence of just a long job interview process that it needs to be done to try to get your selections right.
Have there ever been any interviews with these pre-draft process with these players where you go, wow, I didn't like that interview. We need to take a look at this and say, maybe this guy shouldn't be a player for our team. Have you ever had interviews where you go, "Wham, this is not a good interview by the kid"?
Yeah, because most of the players they're coached up by their
Yep.
agents to answer all the most popular questions. And so when you're in these interviews, you're really trying to get them out of their element and out of their comfort zone. You don't want a disingenuous liar on your team. Like that's not good for morale. It's not good for team building. So it's really kind of just about getting a feel for the player. Obviously everybody has their own opinion, but it,
Sure.
it it's part of again the decision making process of you're investing draft picks and millions of dollars into these players. You want to get the best assessment of them that you can.
All right, finishing up the draft process. So the trade calls. Give us an overview of the trade calls before the draft and during the draft.
They really start, right after the season at the All-Star games with,
Hmm.
it just starts with general managers running into each other,
Yeah.
at the practices, things like that. It picks up at the combine. Um, then it kind of escalates, as you're sitting in draft meetings and you're like, oh, we really like this guy, but we're picking low. We got to try to move up. And so then it really picks up, a couple of days before the draft too, if you haven't already made a move. I mean, when I was in Carolina, we made the move to the number one pick for Bryce Young pretty early in the offseason, but um, a lot of teams like to try to play coy and say, well, we'll see who, we'll see when we're on the clock, see if there's someone, our guys there, things like that. And then, during the draft, um, as the picks are falling and your board's being cleaned and you kind of look at evaluate of, okay, well, if we move back here, there's five players that we like. If we move back 3 spots, we can still get one of those players, things like that. So
Does it get kind of heated?
probably the best draft trade I was ever a part of, I
Yeah.
think it was 2004 with the St. Louis Rams, where Marshall Faulk was at the end of his career,
Mm.
and we needed a replacement for him. And at that time, Steven Jackson from Oregon State was the best running back in the draft. And we were picking later in the first round, and I don't want to say he was falling to us. It's just a lot of teams didn't have a need for running back like we did. And behind us was Dallas Cowboys. I think it was Bill Parcells' first year. We all know how much he likes big power backs, and so we just kind of made the decision, say, "Hey, he's there. We want him. Let's go get him." We moved up a couple spots with Cincinnati to make sure that Dallas didn't take him, and ended up being a great draft pick for us. I think he had at
Mm.
least 8 consecutive 1,000-yard seasons, and then
He did. Yeah.
coincidentally, Dallas, the next pick that they had after that pick, they drafted a running back. So I
Hmm.
guess my intuition was a little correct.